ladies and gentlemen. This is Alexis Dixon with the, how do you say it, with Anthony Davis. There are no words to describe his talent, his brilliance, his creativity. He is a jazz pianist, he's a composer, and he has written 8 operas, the most recent one, Central Park 5. Anthony, thank you for being with us today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Now you can see the cats in the background.
I could see
Just climbed up and I made this large boom. I was trying to figure out what piece of musical equipment just fell on the floor.
I think the cat wants to know, is he or she going to be in your next opera? I think that's what, she's listening to see. Am I going to be the next opera?
He is an opera. He's a tragic, he's a hero in himself,
Well, speaking of operas, congratulations on the Pulitzer Prize. I mean, where were you when you found out the news, and how did it feel?
Oh, it was great. I mean, it was very funny because I was on Zoom. I had a Zoom faculty meeting with the music department, and the phone rang, and I thought, well, I'm just gonna, because it was from New York, so I didn't know what to do. So I said, well, I'll just answer, say I'll call them back. I'm just gonna answer briefly, say I call them back. I'm in a meeting, blah blah blah. So I pick up the phone to say that, and then the guys. Frank O'Terry from New Music USA said to me, well, congratulations. And I said, for what? And he said, well, you're the winner of the Pulitzer Prize in Music for 2020. And I said, what? No. So then I finally said, I called up my wife, Cindy, I won the Pulitzer Prize, not realizing that I had forgotten to mute the iPad for the faculty meeting. So the whole faculty found out at the same time I did.
Unbelievable. What does that? How does that validate you? What does the Pulitzer? Because you have a larger body of work. You've written 8 operas. You're a jazz musician. You're a composer. I've watched you play with amazing ensembles. And what does it mean to your creativity and to you as a person to win a prize like that? What does it validate, and what can't it validate?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think. Well, for me, it validates the idea that one can do political work and work that challenges the audience and challenges people to look at and relook at particularly issues of race in America. And I hope it encourages other artists that they can create works that challenge that, that raise those issues. And I think that's one of the things I think is really important, that art can speak to our times, particularly the political crisis that we face in our time. So that's something that's very important to me. And that I never look at art as just entertainment. Art is not, to me, about being an entertainer. It's about also, because of the obligation to the past, the obligation to that there were those great artists who preceded me, like Duke Ellington and Charles Mingus and Thelonious Monk and Billy Strayhorn, who set the stage for what I do as an artist, and so that's something I always feel that connection and that responsibility.
Speak about the role of Count Basie in your life when you talk about the greats who came before you. And I mean, what I hear you saying is my work is narrative, and it's not only entertainment. In fact, you said it's not entertainment, it's really about a narrative. Can you talk about the role of Count Basie in the work you do in presenting narrative?
Well, he's one of the inventors of swing, So whenever whenever we approach swing, we have to think about what the Basie Orchestra did. Particularly, the early members, Papa Joe Jones, who's the drummer, reinvented how the drum set was played and how we realized swing. And then, of course, the legendary bass player Walter Page, who really invented the walking bass line. So I think all that is part of how our music has progressed. Particularly the innovations of the 30s and the 40s. So that we owe a tremendous debt. Even Ellington was influenced by Basie too. When you hear the big band music of the 40s and how Basie's this in Kansas City swing particularly influenced Duke.
Interesting. At the age 10, you lived in Italy, and you had a professor who was I think you were in his philosophy class, and you were studying existentialism. And you
Right,
met a guy named Nietzsche and a guy named Kierkegaard. Tell me what was the
right.
influence on this 10th grader in meeting those two men in a class in existentialism?
Well, it had a profound effect on me. I had this wonderful class. The teacher was Charles McKay. He was going to be a priest, and he had come to Rome to become a priest, and then he fell in love with a woman, and decided that priesthood was
That
not for him.
happens in Italy. In Italy, that can happen.
That was not going to happen. That was not happening. But not only that, he decided God was dead too. So he became an existentialist. So he teaches the English class at my school. It's the American school in Torino. And so he decided to offer a philosophy class. So I took philosophy, and I remember reading Birth of Tragedy and Either Or, and I think I read the one about Abraham and Isaac. That I read, the Kierkegaard. So it affected me greatly. I guess I became kind of an existentialist myself, which may not have been good for my studies, in the future when I was a junior in high school back in the United States. But because I said, well, what does it matter, But I was really into, but it set the stage for my thinking about opera, because Nietzsche in particular. And I also Kierkegaard's essays on Don Giovanni. And at that point, I never really heard an opera. I never been to an opera. But the idea of opera fascinated me, the idea of combining music and theater and drama. And I began to think also about what Nietzsche described as the Dionysian and the Apollonian, the opposition of this duality in art, between this kind of cerebral and structure and form of the Apollonian, and the more passionate, in the spirit of revolution, ideas of the Dionysian. So I began to think about that and how that translated into America. So I really thought what Nietzsche was describing was more apropos to American music than German music, and particularly because of the influence of the African diaspora, and thinking about the influence of the improviser and what we take from our African heritage, and then also of course the European aspect of of structure, form, and that we the Americans inherited. So I thought this fusion of those two would create what is American art.
It's the complexity of that is, I mean, what can you say? There's so much complexity there. And I wondered when you did the opera on the Central Park Five, why you chose opera as a form of narrative and storytelling for the Central Park Five. And as you talked about the complexity of the black experience, the African American experience, in all its textures and expressions, opera seemed rather fitting. Is that how you came to
opera because you actually tell the story with music. The music is embedded into the narrative, so it drives the narrative. So the music always has to be part of the action. And what I don't like about most musicals, there are certainly exceptions, is that the music doesn't necessarily drive the narrative. Music is more in the position of stasis, in which the characters stop and the action stops, and the interaction of the characters kind of comes to a stop, and then you hear the music, and then you go back into the dialogue. So that tension always bothered me. I like the idea. I was much more comfortable with having through composed music, in which music embraces the whole story and also takes you emotionally from one place to another.
So is the music speaking to an emotion that doesn't have words, that lives beyond words? Is the music, would it be the pain of the characters or the story? Is it the textured landscape of the complexity of the emotions they're feeling that they just can't give a language to? Is that what some of the music does in the opera?
Well, to me, music does everything. It establishes time and place and atmosphere. It creates tension. And I think that for me, tension, the tension in terms of making that the scenes come alive. In that sense, it's really important to embrace in the music. And also, then in terms of the character, you're revealing the character, it reveals their vulnerabilities, etc. So one thing about opera that's so funny is that characters get to voice their inner selves. When an actor, like in a movie or play, would never think about, telling the audience what they feel. I mean, because they're supposed to so they do that with their acting. They have sometimes they use what a subtext of the internal life of the character that they bring to the performance. So you have the feeling of the past and all that. But in opera, a lot of arias actually tell that where the feeling comes from, where it comes from. So you can talk a little bit about that. The subtext is really brought to the fore, and particularly the psychological subtext. Why, what puts a character in a certain position.
So the audience is then taking this emotional voyage, at least invited to take an emotional voyage with the character in real time.
Yes, and also the fact that they also identify with the five. That was very important in the opera, that I felt that the audience, whether black, white, Asian, anybody, realized that they could be the five, or their children could be the five, and really identify with them and understand that, that what they go through is what you go through. So that immediacy, that feeling of what trying to, and as I wrote the music, I tried to understand what it must have felt like to be in that position, and how horrific and terrifying it was, and the fact that how they felt there was the need to confess to a crime they did not commit. So there's the idea of how the DA and the mask figure in the opera try to coerce them into confessing, is in a way about how they how they tear them apart as individuals.
It's interesting because when we talk about that, I mean, these were boys, one Latino and 4 African American between the ages of 14 and 16. These were children.
Yes, children. That's definitely. And one of them, because he was 16, was actually tried as an adult. So he ended up in an adult prison for 13 years.
And ended up meeting the person who actually committed the crime while he was in prison.
Yes. He met him in prison at Rikers. I said in Rikers, actually, early on. And actually they got in a fight in prison, which was over the television, I think. What was on television? But then later, Matias Reyes became a born-again Christian, and he wanted to confess for all his crimes, and so he confessed that he actually had raped the Central Park trucker Miss Miele, and so. And through his confession, they found DNA evidence linking him to the crime.
Interesting.
No DNA evidence with the 5.
Talk a little bit about how the project came to you and what attracted you to the project. How did the project find you, or did you find it? And what was the journey in creating this story?
Well, it found me, actually, because Kevin Maynor, who runs an opera singer who runs the Trilogy Opera Company, sent me a libretto. He said, well, could you read this libretto and recommend someone to write music for this libretto? And it was a libretto by Richard Wesley based on the Central Park 5. So I read the libretto and I called him back and I said, I'd like to do it, because I thought the subject was really rich. The first draft of the libretto did not have Donald Trump in it. So,
that's right.
No, so I said, well, you have to have Trump in the opera. I mean, you can't do this. And I guess he thought that the mask could kind of represent Trump and all the other kind of negative figures who kind of perpetuate racism, et cetera, in the opera. But I thought it was important to have Trump in the opera, and also a female DA who was also not in the original libretto, because And then so we were able to, with the revisions, create those add those two characters to the opera, and that really helped in terms of, seeing how the opera would develop.
And I believe, if I remember correctly, you started the opera, I think serendipitously, 3 days after Trump either announced he was going to run for president or was inaugurated. Which one is it?
Well, actually, the performance of it, we did a performance in Newark, kind of workshop production of the opera that was done the Friday after the election, 2016, the Friday after the election. So we were in rehearsal during the time of on the election day. I was in rehearsal with that opera, and so Trump's rise happened. I think I started the opera in 2015, beginning of 2015. I started working on it, so you could see Trump's rise through the whole. It was happening during the whole time I was working on the opera.
I realized that I'm making the assumption that the audience know the story of the Central Park Five. Can you give us a brief summary of what the story is so the audience can catch up with us a bit, for those of them who may not know what the story is?
The woman, Tricia Miele, was assaulted and raped in Central Park. She was called the Central Park Jogger at one point. And there are a number of African American and Hispanic youths had descended into the park. Actually, they just have a good time. Sometimes to do, like upend trash cans and do kind of mischievous things in the park. So the police were eager to round up some young men that they were going to hold and charge with the crime. And initially they held a number of young men. I mean, initially I think they had 6 for a while, and then they allowed 1 to go. So eventually they settled on the 5, and the 5 were all accused of the assault charge and etc. And they were also tried in the press. The press was very inflammatory in terms of racial tensions and racial relations in New York. And Donald Trump actually put a full-page ad in the Post and the Daily News calling for the return of the death penalty. And he said, "Support our police, bring back the death penalty." That was the slogan. So Trump seized upon this event to advance his political career. I think the beginning of his political career was with the Central Park Five. By vilifying the Central Park Five and demonizing them, he was able to take advantage of the racial tensions in New York and galvanize some of the extreme white groups within New York behind him. And the irony was, this all happened in 1989. And 1989 is significant because it also represented the emergence of hip hop into the mainstream culture. So when there was, for example, when the whole expression was in the Post and the Daily News, they said "wilding in the park." These teenagers wilding. Now, wilding came from a Tone Loc song called "Wild Thing." So they were actually singing They were singing "Wild Thing" when they went into the park, the kids. So it wasn't wilding; it's "Wild Thing." Wow. But wilding became this phenomenon they talked about, and but it was also symbolic of the fear particularly in the white population in New York of hip hop culture. The hip hop culture was sort of this idea, this fostering rebellion and violence, and it was a threat particularly a threat to the real estate ambitions of Donald Trump, who was looking to. When you look at the development of the Upper West Side, or the West Side in Manhattan, all the apartment buildings along the river, et cetera, how important Central Park is in that. It's like the link between the West Side and Harlem. And so, there's it is. Bring back our police. And you see the other sign saying, "Do the right thing."
Right.
That's very interesting. Okay, because Spike Lee's movie came out in 1989. So actually, my theory is that when they put these 5 young men in prison, they were putting Radio Raheem in prison.
Can you tell everyone what Radio Raheem is?
Radio Raheem is the character with the boombox
Yes.
who
And
goes
do the
into the
right
pizza
thing.
parlor, and he's playing his music very loudly. And Danny Aiello, who plays the owner of the pizza joint, gets really upset and doesn't want to hear that music. And he doesn't have any black figures on. He has like white famous people like Joe DiMaggio and Sinatra and people like that on the wall, but there are no black people, pictures of black people on the wall. So he points this out, and then he turns up the music, and then Danny Aiello takes a baseball bat and smashes the boombox. So that scene to me and crystallizes a lot of what I think was going on. The fear and antipathy toward this new music and new culture, hip hop, which is also was starting to permeate white culture too.
That's right.
And white middle America. And so in a way, this act of finally, putting these 5 young men in prison was a way to rectify and to submerge the emergence of hip hop.
We're looking at I don't know, can you see the screen? Can you see the Wilding 17's help in rate beating?
Wilding and street slang for going berserk. See? And that's from the song. It's wild thing. It's not wilding. So they even got that wrong, so that's the way it is.
It's interesting that when you think of opera and you think of the 5 boys of Central Park, the Central Park 5, the folks who go to opera don't know anything about the lives of the Central Park 5. And generally speaking, the boys of Central Park 5 know nothing about opera. So essentially, you've converged 2 worlds to come into a theater to sit and watch the experience side by side with each other. What was that like, and what were you hoping they collectively would walk away from the theater with? What behavior or information did you want those 2 worlds to converge and to walk away with?
That's a very interesting question. I think that one of the things was in the audience at Long Beach was there are many people who came to the opera because of the Central Park 5, the subject matter, who had never seen an opera, including people. I had a number of young men who had been incarcerated and falsely accused of a crime, who were in jail, and they came to the opera, and for them it was a very emotional experience. And then I think the mixture of the opera audience looking at the subject matter that they wouldn't usually see in an opera, and then a large audience that would never go to an opera, who were seeing an opera for the first time. And I think that's wonderful to me, because in a way they're both having novel experiences. They were having, there's an experience they hadn't had before, taken out of, the opera crowd being confronted with issues and asked to empathize with someone that they may not normally feel, normally empathize with. And then the audience of the people who came for the story, realizing hearing music that they may not have heard before, but also an extent, the music also drew upon, the African American tradition in different ways. So they heard, for example, when they were going into the park, I wrote a parody of a P-Funk song, which was Bringing the Funk. Who's got the funk? Yeah, is
that Parliament?
Huh?
Is that Parliament?
Yeah, Parliament Funkadelic. Yeah, George Clinton. So I thought of using that because how hip hop always borrows. I mean, they're sampling music all the time. So they sample, particularly R&B from the 70s is ripe for it. They do that all the time. So I bringing that in, that suggestion of that song. But rather than sampling, I write parody. So the idea is that going into the park was that in a way that excitement, youthful excitement, and youthful and naive excitement.
And the innocence of youth.
Realizing their sexuality, who they are, trying to go in the park, and there's kind of exuberance that's crushed. as crushed when this awful thing happened, and then also with the police response. So I think that was very interesting to me.
And that's an innocence that never can be recovered. That's an innocence that can never be retrieved.
And they always all the five talk about the loss of innocence.
Yeah.
That they lost their childhood, lost their youth. And I have an aria was Sharon Salam talks about that. And then also Corey's aria at the end of in Act 3, and actually addresses that too.
Yeah, Amanda, I think we have Corey's aria. Amanda, can you cue Corey's aria so it speaks to what Anthony just spoke about? Amanda is our technologist. She said, "We'll do my best." When you cue it, let me know. Let me talk to you, Anthony, on a personal level. The Black experience in America, there's something about, I always marvel that people love colors and everything except people. People would drive and catch a sunset and marvel at the colors of the sunset. We look at a rainbow and marvel at the colors of the rainbow. But when it comes to colors and people, there seems to be a dissonance. And I've never understood how we can love color in everything except people. Having written the opera and inviting these two different worlds to come together and sit together, for that moment, I think something magical happens, right? There's something, here's Corey's aria.
This is just a piano, but okay. Yeah. Oh, I have to see a commercial. Oh my God. I could have sent you a clip without it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think Amanda's going to cue that shortly. But I mean, when we look at your life, have you had those experiences? I mean,
yes, I have.
Did you graduate from
here? I was actually, the first time I came to California with my first wife, my ex-wife, and we were driving from San Francisco to LA, and with my friend Wes Brown, who's also African American. And so we're driving in the streets of LA, and a cop comes from behind me, puts his alarm on, everything, that siren. So I stop and I said, I don't think I was speeding. I don't know what's going on. So he comes to the window of the car. I open up the car, and he asked my wife, who is white, and he asked, "Are you okay?"
So he turns on, hold on. He turns on the siren behind you, pulls you over, comes into the car, and asks your wife if she's okay.
If she's okay, because she's with two black men. Like, has she been abducted or what? Is she okay?
Yeah.
So that was pretty bizarre. I mean, I thank God she didn't hate me then. She said, no, I'm fine. But you
didn't just have a big fight.
No, I didn't have a fight. So, I mean, she could have screwed me over really bad.
and we laugh at that, but that's the fragility.
It's the fragility of those situations. And I've had other situations as well, with police and stuff.
So when you write an aria, when you write the Central Park 5, is that, well, here is Corey's aria. Okay.
I hope you can hear it.
No, there's no volume. There's no volume. I think we're going to try to get it later. So when you write it,
this is me trying to be a behind-the-scenes producer. So thanks.
You know what? I can send you. Oh shoot!
I can try it one more.
Yeah,
time.
I have a clip of that.
Let me try it one more time. Thanks, guys.
No problem. Thank you, Amanda. When you write the opera, is that, here we go.
They stole my mind, my happiness, stole away, taken away, the chance of me that will rip out. All I ever wanted was for truth to come shining through. I need everyone to but now that the truth has come, why does it hurt more than the lie that brought me so low?
That's Nathan Granter as Corey Wise. That must be very difficult to rehearse.
Yeah.
I mean,
Can't hear the piano so well in that, but that
You
was,
can hear the pianos. We'll post that. We'll post that one on Facebook so folks can hear it if they haven't seen it. Tell me a little bit about the actor who sings this and what. Tell us about the cast a bit. The five men.
okay. That's Nathan Granter, wonderful tenor who's playing Corey Wise, and he's an incredible musician and singer.
And Corey Wise was the oldest of the five boys.
Yes, he was the one who was in prison for 13 years. So the others were released from youth detention centers after 7 years. So he was in prison almost twice as long, and also in a male and an adult facility upstate. And he definitely paid the price for it. I mean, he always refers to him as the one rather than the five. He doesn't think of himself really because his experience is so different. And he says, "I have the scars to prove it."
When you write something like this, how long does it take to shake it? Because you've had experiences. I mean, it's one thing to write a story about the 16th century or the 17th century, or to write a story of a fictional character. It's another thing to write a story, an opera, about an experience that you share, that you have lived and you know about. You started the opera in what, 2017?
15, yeah, that's when I started.
2015, and in 2019, it was on stage. What was the release? Well, after that was over, how long does it take to release the characters and the story that you've immersed yourself in for so long?
Well, it was interesting also because I met the five. I met all five of them in LA at, there was a luncheon at the ACLU in LA, downtown LA, actually celebrating the five. They all received a medal from the Civil Liberties Union. And so I attended that with also the five cast members who were playing them. So they got to meet all the five. And then also the five from the Netflix production were there too as well. So it's kind of a mixture of all the casts from Netflix and my cast from the opera and the real people were all there at one event. And so I got to spend some time talking to all of them, particularly with Yusef Salaam about the opera and about his experiences and stuff. And it was great. It was great to meet them and to realize your responsibility because you're dealing with people who are still living their lives and trying to forge a new identity today. And so it was exciting for us to do that, but also made us realize the awesome responsibility we have in portraying them.
Are you hopeful that things will change? I mean, one of the things you said is that I don't do art, I do art to tell a story. Through your storytelling of your craft, are you hopeful that things will get better? Do you have a sense of there is a point where there will be greater understanding and appreciation for each other? Are you hopeful that way?
Well, you always hope for that. I think a lot of the frictions, a lot of the divisions are so deep in America. I mean, it still exists. We still fight the Civil War every day. And it's fought out in terms of how people look at African Americans and and our role in society, et cetera. I mean, this election, for example, is we're still dealing with some of the same battles. You know, the suppression of, they're trying to suppress the vote. They're trying to bring back the poll tax, a lot of the stuff that we protested about in the 1960s. So I think I think we're realizing that the idea when Obama was elected, we were post-racial. I think has been safely proven wrong. What we're dealing with now is what was the classic white backlash, what they used to call this in the late 60s, the white backlash. And I think Trump is a figure who represents that, and also trying to bring back some of the institutional ways in which racism was enforced. I mean, I think what's edifying is to look at, Henry Louis Gates did this documentary on Reconstruction. And one of the reasons he did that documentary is because it reflects so much on our time now. We're in a period after if you look at the civil rights struggle as really the second Civil War. And that you know, in effect, we're in a kind of Reconstruction period now, where you see for example, the Trump, you know, taking over the judicial system, you know, the judges who are appointed, you know, very conservative, right-wing judges, et cetera. Also the you know, the way they're trying to reinforce institutional racism across the board.
Did you see the image on screen? Can you tell us what the image is that we're looking at? I think that's
yes. This is actually that's Trump as young Trump, but people got to remember this is a younger Trump, so he's much more like Don Jr. than like the Trump we know now. So that's Thomas playing Trump, and then the woman is there plays the DA, but also plays in this scene a reporter. So you see that, and he's being interviewed, and see the hand gestures.
Mm-hmm.
So he adapted, you know, those are all those are white supremacy gestures. That sign there is the sign of white supremacy thing that Trump does all the time, and it's a lot of his gestures when he's speaking.
How do you express yourself and the complexity of your emotions through your music? I mean, you know, the beauty of jazz is improvisational. And what I heard you say earlier was that in your opera, you improvise within your opera. How does jazz allow you to express the complexity of who you are? And how do you migrate from jazz to opera to all the other compositions that you do, the act of composing? How does that all come together to give expression to something about you?
Well, I think it's all together in one thing. I never look at separate music in that way. So I think of, you know, when I was, for example, in the opera, when the opera begins, there's a section that evokes Harlem, but it's almost a nostalgic Harlem. This is Duke Ellington's Harlem. So and the lyrics are, Richard wrote, and the Mass sings this, Harlem, a black and tan fantasy. Now, if you're going to say black and tan fantasy, what am I going to do? Okay, I have to think of Ellington and Strayhorn, and in my case also Mingus too, which is, I love Charles Mingus's music. So to me, channeling that into my music, into my language, was a natural thing. It's part of who I am as a composer. And to evoke that as, in a way, the nostalgic look of the Harlem of the past, the Harlem that was, you know, the elegant Harlem of the 30s, the Harlem that exists, Ellington's Harlem, you know, Sugar Hill, and so that was important for me to do, and it's kind of setting up the story, and then realizing that the Harlem that the Five live in is quite different from that.
Is it a loss? Did we lose something when we lost that Harlem? Could we get that back? Could there be a renaissance?
Yeah, I think there is a renaissance in Harlem. I mean, if you look at Harlem now, you know, when they built the Schomburg Library, there are other things, Harlem Museum. In terms of arts, definitely there's a revival in Harlem. Harlem has become, but also been gentrified too. I mean, you see, you know, my brother lives on 130th Street, And when I'm walking around there, I see all these converted brownstones, with garages and the first floor, like it's ridiculous, and they're like really, like art. Could probably have an article on Arts and Architecture magazine or something. So I realized that Harlem that's different. That's a gentrified Harlem, but it's really, so it's fascinating to me, how the community has evolved, over, the last 100 years. So, and so depicting them, then the five, and then when I used the parody of the Parliament Funkadelic music to introduce them to the park, it was this idea of that energized hip hop Harlem that was what was happening. That was reinventing Harlem yet again.
What are we looking at here?
Oh, this is each of the five with their parents, some of their parents. They finally brought them in to visit them, and they're all expressing, their vulnerabilities and the parents' concern for them. And that was happening. They had already been held for at least 30 hours before that, without food or water.
And the only evidence they had was the forced confession of these 14 to 16-year-old boys. They had no DNA evidence. They had nothing other than the forced confession of these boys.
Very little physical evidence, yeah. And actually, they didn't have a video confession of Yusef Salam. He never agreed to confess. So I don't even know how they convicted him, but they did. But also they got them to turn on each other. I think that's part of it. Even though the most of them didn't know each other. One of the ironies is the five who were so bound together in this horrible persecution. Actually, most of them didn't know each other. Corey knew Yusef. Corey and Yusef were were friends. But other than that, they really only maybe knew about each other something, but they didn't really know each other.
Interesting. What are we looking at here? What is this image?
This is Sharon Salam. This is it's a wonderful performer playing Sharon Salam, and she's enraged. And she also accuses the DA of lying to the court. And this actually happened in the trial. In the trial, she disrupted the trial and said that the DA had lied because they claimed that they didn't know how old the kids were, because they were not legally allowed to interrogate them without a parent present. You're not allowed to interrogate a minor. And they did anyway. So she's basically saying that the DA said, well, they didn't know how old they were. And she said that DA is lying. And this actually happened in the court proceeding. So that became a dramatic moment as we were going into the trial. I actually wasn't in original libretto, but when I found out later that this incident happened, I said, we have to have it in the opera.
Is there a piece of the story that was not in the opera that you wish it was in retrospect? Do you look back and think, oh my gosh, we should have put this piece in?
Yeah, well, a little bit more about Corey Wise and his relationship to hip hop.
Okay.
And that's something I thought about a lot. I could never figure out how to put it in, because he actually has this statement. I read a lot of Corey Wise's interviews and statements, and he said, I am hip hop. And hip hop is me. So I wanted to have an aria, I am hip hop and hip hop is me. So earlier in the opera somewhere, because I think that was really interesting, because and he actually goes around, he always has a earphone in, and he listens to, it's funny, the hip hop he listens to is not the Kendrick Lamar, all stuff like, or the current stuff. It's stuff from the 80s.
Interesting.
So he listens to, like he was frozen in that time.
Yeah. But that's the
hip hop.
that was the pre-misogynistic hip hop, right? That was the hip hop that
Yeah, well,
was.
that was, yeah, Tone Loc, and, and then Public
Right.
Enemy, and, so, and that's something, I mean, I listened a lot to Public Enemy, so I knew a lot of theirs. I didn't know Tone Loc as well. I had to catch up on I listened to him. I listened to different versions of Wild Thing as well. So I had to do a lot of musical research, and it was fun, listening to, that hip hop of that period.
Describe your creativity. I ask this quite a bit to artists, and describe your creative process. How does your creativity, how does that manifest in you? And I ask this question quite a bit. And do you have a relationship with your creativity? What does that look like when you're in the creative mode? Are you solitary? Are you isolated? Are you walking? Are you speaking with your creativity? What's the relationship between you and that process?
Some of it is solitary. It's when I really surrender the project, when I really get immersed in it. And then I start singing all the stuff I'm writing. I sing it. And my family gets upset because I'm so loud. And I'm hearing this stuff in my head, and then, so I just have to write it down. I have to write it down. And it's like, it's an exciting thing. That's what I live for. And sometimes I dream music. I hear it in my dreams, so I wake up and I write it down. And so I hear things, and I'm so immersed in it that I see the opera being staged, and when I'm dreaming, or when I'm thinking about it. So so it's really a total immersion into something. And then I get this moments of revelation when I find out things about the piece. It's the piece speaking to me. Sometimes I always tell my students there's a moment when you think you're in control of the piece, and you're trying to control everything and try to figure out the dimensions of the project and how it's going to work. But the moments that you live for are the moments when the piece speaks to you. So it's telling you what it needs to be.
Is that a moment of surrender? You use the word surrender. Can you define?
Yeah, you have to surrender to that. Yeah, definitely. Sometimes it's not in your control. It's like something, oh, okay. So I now I have to deal with it. And sometimes it might be when you break a mold. You set up a mold, you set up this structure, and the structure is playing itself out. And then all of a sudden it says, no, now's the time this has to break out of that. Something has to happen. And so it's very, very illuminating, because it's the piece also speaks to you, because now you have a history of what you've done before, and the past, and what is in the piece before. Because in an opera, in order to sustain a 2-hour piece of music, you have to have elements from the beginning that recur, things that are brought back, that are suggested in the beginning, that become manifest later. So that's in a way, there's a kind of inevitability about some of the music. So there's the sense of this has to happen because it happened there. This has to happen. This is the result of that. And then if you violate that, if you do, that has to be for a dramatic reason, for a very strong reason, that is where something becomes a departure, especially as you move toward the end of the opera. Those moments are really precious, because you see it's like windows into something else. And like when I wrote Corey's aria, I wrote that rather late in the process. I wrote that, after I did the earlier production in Newark, and before I did it in Long Beach. I wrote Corey's aria and Sharon's aria. But all those arias were like windows into something else. They were all like departures from what some of the language that was in the opera before.
What I love about Corey's opera is that you're hearing words and you're hearing narrative, but it's saying so much more than what the words are saying. There's something about what's being said that requires a different kind of listening, that if you just listen to the words, you miss what he's saying.
Right. Well, that's why they sometimes they use super titles too, so you can get the understand the words and feel the music too. And that's been good. I mean, I used to make a joke when they first Beverly Sills is one of the first people to initiate super titles in America in the productions at New York City Opera. And I remember being shocked at first that she wanted super titles for my opera X. And it was in 1986. And so, but she's done super titles, you know, certainly Italian operas or operas in French, et cetera, or German. So I made a joke. I said, well, you know, that scene in Airplane, you know, when Kareem says to the guy, they say, and when they start translating the Black English. So I said, well, I guess you need to translate the Black English, you know.
Has the Pulitzer Prize, has the Pulitzer Prize put pressure on you to be creative? Has it emancipated your creativity? Is it the kind of thing where you feel that you're now under a particular kind of microscope, so now you are either going to be forced into a particular genre, or there's expectations about you, or do you just don't give a damn about any of that, and you're just going to do what the hell?
No, there are expectations. I mean, that's been my thing for a while. I mean, everyone wants to commission me now to do operas that are political, that are about social, you know, like so for example, they want to do, there's an opera about Dylan Roof and the shootings at Mother Emanuel Church called The Darkest Light in the Heart. And the libretto is brilliant. I love it. So I do want to do it. So, but naturally they come to me with it. and then the Tulsa Race Massacre, you know, there's the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacres next year in 2021. So Tulsa Opera approached me about doing an opera based on the Tulsa race, and they call it Race Riot. I call it Massacre. So they got mad because I call it Massacre instead of Race Riot. But anyway, and then they ended up canceling because the Black community in Tulsa said, well, the foundation that was going to fund it, they went to them and said, well, why are you funding an opera when you should be paying reparations?
Interesting.
So they got canceled. So, I mean, that's part of the perils of being in doing political work. But I'm interested in doing, us expanding what I do, doing topics that they wouldn't expect me to do. Like, I want to do an opera based on The Reef, which is Edith Wharton novel that I've been working on. I made 4 scenes of that. And then my big dream is to do The Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And I'd like to do that. But that's a huge undertaking that would involve, you know, it's going to be like 3.5 hours. It's going to be Wagnerian in length, you know. And they're going to have to, you know, I need the Met or someone to do that.
You know, how this is, you know, as you talk about this, I'm sitting with the young African-American man that was jogging and was killed because he was suspected of robbery. Today I was in the car, I was listening to NPR. Yes. The same. And then today I was in the car listening to NPR, and the police officer was called because he thought there was a forgery. Somebody had forged something, and 5 officers came, and one officer put his knee on the neck of an African-American man and killed him. I mean, on video, people are watching this. How does this speak to your work? How does this touch you? How does this inform you? As we talk about, you know, you did Malcolm X, and one of the things I'm thinking about, if you were to do X all over again, would it be different? And if Malcolm X was here, what would he say to this, for everything he's fought for? So as I'm coming to the closure of this with you, I'm thinking about Frederick Douglass, I'm thinking about Du Bois, I'm thinking about Sojourner Truth, I'm thinking about all the young African-American men that are in prison for doing very menial crimes. I'm thinking about the young men and women who were killed under the hands of police
Yeah.
brutality.
The irony is,
How do we speak to this? How do we speak to this?
well, I think that's the burden. That's something that's the responsibility. That's something I Black Lives Matter movement. That's one of the reasons I did Central Park 5, because I wanted to address. I'll look at the genesis of the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think is with the 5, and address the fact that this is the violence is ongoing. I mean, I had at the end of Central Park 5, the 5 look around and there's a video of of this young kid who's playing with his cell phone, pretending it's a gun in Milwaukee, and the police arrive, and so it just stops there. But realizing that the issues of social justice are still important and still with us, and something we have to fight for every day. And I mean, the Arbery case with what happened to that young man in Georgia, you know, thinking about, you know, you jogging and it's then someone thinks that you're looking at a construction site and you must have been doing criminal activity. And so that this and the way in which Black lives are not protected in the same way in America. And that's been clear. That's something we see, and something that has to be addressed in terms of reform in the police departments. Also, who is in the police department? If you look at how many white supremacists find themselves get themselves in policing, you know, so we have to monitor that carefully. The fact that racial animus, you know, and racial disposition like that is not acceptable. And I think Malcolm would not be surprised. Malcolm would not be surprised. He knew, as he said, violence is as American as apple pie, and that you know, the backlash against the progress we made, he would expect. But that's why we have to remain vigilant, and the fact, and also to look at our situation. We're always in a volatile situation, and and we can't take our freedom for granted.
And so what's the calling to all good people? I'm using that word, all people who seek justice and equity. What is the calling at this point in time?
Well, I think the calling is to be vigilant and to be active, and also to realize our responsibility that the reality is that the racial divisions live within us, and also and they can be exploited by bad people, and to realize that we have to be vigilant and point out injustice and bring and know that there is consequence for the kind of repressive activity, you know. And I think that's really important. I mean, sometimes when I think of Malcolm X, I think, for example, when they talk about gun control, okay? I think gun control is an issue I'm profoundly interested in too. But the best way for us to get gun control is for Blacks to organize into militias and have guns. And then they'd ask for gun control in 2 minutes. That's how they got gun control in California, because the Black Panthers had guns. So, but that's just part of it. I mean, part of and it's unfortunate, and it's a reality, and something we live with every day. And also, I think that what we're seeing, even with the COVID environment, you know, who are the people protesting the stay-at-home orders and et cetera? They're mostly white Americans. And they're exercising, they're mad because they can't exercise their white privilege. And so it's an assault on their white privilege. So I think that there has to be a reckoning with that. And part of it comes from the deep sense of inferiority, I think, from, you know, particularly the white and Caucasians who have been left behind in our social system. So that feeling of threat, and the feeling that people of color and immigrants and other people, the other, is a threat to their livelihood and their safety and their sense of well-being and who they are.
I think it's interesting as you say that, and our time is almost up, and I want to talk to you for another hour. My background is conflict resolution. So my background is psychotherapy and conflict resolution. And one of the things I've always thought about America in its definition of its greatness, and it's really a question, as great as this country is, I've always wondered, why is America so afraid to have complex conversations that does not always lead to a nice, tidy answer? That do we not have the capacity to have really complicated and messy conversations about who we are collectively and individually, and sit within that uncomfortableness to discover who the heck we are as a culture and where we're going? Because if nothing else, other than the benefit of the conversation is self-examination individually and collectively. Are we afraid of self-examination? Is America afraid?
I think there's a deep fear of self-examination. Yeah, because it's too easy just to, I mean, social media is all about reaction, about a rapid response to something, the other, looking who, and you kind of look at them in the other. You say, okay, you don't look at anyone as a person. And so that leveling, and that's the problem. That's the problem with a different kind of leveling. There's a leveling that goes on that dehumanizes. We do humanize things to level it. And unfortunately, sometimes people think that's democracy. But leveling is not democracy. Leveling is dehumanizing. And so I think we all in different ways feel that. And so we're, in a way, we feel that, so it's the need to strike back, because in a way it's an act of self-defense. And it can be viewed as an act of self-defense when in fact it's how we look at ourselves as less human.
Scott Peck, in his book, The Road Less Traveled, said the opposite of love isn't hate. The opposite of love is laziness, because love requires behavior. It requires action. Yeah. It requires engagement.
Action, hate is action, emotion too.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I think that's part of something to that. And I think, it's a dangerous time. We're in a very dangerous period. I mean, I was watching this series called Babylon Berlin, which is about Berlin between the wars, particularly up to, I think it got up to 1929, the last episode. The Great Depression finally happened. And you see the kind of rise of the Nazis and the threat they thought was posed by the Bolsheviks, et cetera. And a lot of that playing out, playing out in our politics. And it's really eerie to think of us as being, Berlin around 1930, So and I think that's serious. I think that's serious. And there's serious potential there, that our basic democratic principles can be lost in the next couple of years.
And so that means you must continue to create music so there's beauty in the world, my friend. We need you. Yeah. We need your stunning, beautiful music. Mr. Davis, thank you for
Thanks so much. I've enjoyed our conversation. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for all the beauty and elegance you bring to the world. Thank you for what you will create in times to come. I look forward to it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. Sorry, say that again, Anthony. Sorry.
I appreciate talking to you. That was fantastic. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, loved it. Thank you so much. This is going to be on Bella V TV on YouTube, Bella V TV YouTube, and then Bella V Cafe Facebook page. So Anthony's interview will be up and available for viewing. And when you go to Bella V TV, hit subscribe, hit like, because there's more geniuses along the line of Anthony coming. Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony.